That Tuesday morning at the Naval War College, Captain Alexandra Lex Morgan walked into a room where she wasn't wanted. Professors who had never set foot on a submarine dismissed her as a practical observer. International officers whispered that she was too direct, too American, too female to understand the elegance of theory. On the massive tactical screen, 6 Allied submarines glided across a digital North Atlantic, each movement choreographed by 15 years of academic doctrine. The professors called it perfection. Lex saw something else, an invisible trap, a flaw no algorithm had noticed. She raised her hand. "Professor, there's a blind spot in your model." Dismissed, laughed off, ignored. Minutes later, 3 submarines were destroyed, 2 more crippled, and a classroom built on theory collapsed into stunned silence. The lesson was clear. Their perfect equations had just killed 5 boats. And that was the moment Lex Morgan stood up. What happened next would transform not only the War College, but the future of submarine warfare itself. The October wind whipped across Narragansett Bay as Captain Alexandra Lex Morgan stepped through the imposing granite gates of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Her auburn hair was pulled back in military regulation, emerald eyes scanning the historic buildings where naval strategy had been refined for over a century. But today wasn't about history, it was about the future of submarine warfare and whether a woman with operational experience belonged in the ivory towers of military academia. But what happened in the next 6 hours would challenge everything the Navy thought it knew about underwater tactics. Professor Dr. Gerald Northcott adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed the morning's roster. At 62, he'd spent more years in lecture halls than most officers spent at sea. His strategic studies department was his kingdom, and today's advanced submarine tactics course was his crown jewel, a theoretical masterpiece that had shaped naval doctrine for 15 years. "Gentlemen," he announced to the assembled international officers, pointedly ignoring Captain Morgan seated in the 3rd row. "Today we examine the mathematical precision of multinational submarine coordination. Theory, not field improvisation, dictates success in modern naval warfare." Little did he know that his precious theory was about to face its greatest test. Commander Michael Ashford, the tactics instructor, nodded approvingly from the side of the classroom. A surface warfare veteran with 21 years of teaching experience, he'd built his reputation on the principle that submarine operations were too complex for field intuition. His gray eyes fixed on Lex Morgan with barely concealed skepticism. "Captain Morgan," Dr. Northcott's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "I understand you're here as our practical observer. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable auditing our basic seamanship courses. This level of theoretical analysis requires a more analytical mindset than operational experience typically provides." The dismissal hung in the air like a challenge, but Lex Morgan's response would surprise everyone. Lex remained seated, her expression calm, but her green eyes flashing with controlled fire. Around her, the international students, officers from Britain, Canada, Brazil, and Germany, watched the exchange with growing tension. This wasn't just about one woman's place in the classroom. It was about whether years of real combat experience meant anything in the halls of theoretical perfection. "Professor Northcott," Lex replied evenly, "I'm here because Admiral Hartwell specifically requested that operational officers participate in curriculum development. But I'm happy to observe, for now." That last phrase carried a weight that would soon prove prophetic. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Randolph, the Marine Corps exchange instructor from NATO, leaned forward with a slight smirk. Her 49 years of European military service had taught her that American women were too aggressive for the subtleties of international cooperation. "Commander Morgan," she interjected with her crisp accent, "surely you understand that managing 6-nation submarine forces requires diplomatic finesse beyond typical American directness." Lieutenant Commander James Westbrook, the British Royal Navy student, shifted uncomfortably. At 34, he'd heard stories about American submarine commanders, but seeing this red-haired woman challenge his instructors felt somehow wrong. His traditionally trained mind couldn't reconcile operational skill with feminine authority. But in 12 minutes, everything he believed about leadership would be shattered. Dr. Northcott activated the massive tactical display at the front of the classroom. 6 submarine icons appeared on a digital map of the North Atlantic, each representing different allied nations. Today's simulation, Operation Deep Unity. 6 submarines must coordinate a complex transit through hostile waters while maintaining communication security and avoiding detection. Commander Michael Ashford stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of 2 decades in academia. The theoretical framework requires precise mathematical timing. Each submarine follows calculated patterns based on sonar probability matrices and threat assessment algorithms. There's no room for improvisation. What none of them realized was that their perfect theory contained a fatal flaw that would be exposed within the hour. The simulation began with clinical precision. On the massive screens, 6 submarines moved in carefully choreographed patterns, following the theoretical doctrine that Dr. Northcott had refined over 15 years. The students watched intently as their instructors demonstrated the mathematical beauty of coordinated underwater warfare. Notice, Dr. Northcott lectured, pointing to the display, how each submarine maintains optimal spacing according to acoustic probability calculations. This is the result of pure theoretical analysis, not chaotic field experience. But Captain Morgan's trained eyes were seeing something else entirely, something that would save lives. 43 minutes into the simulation, the first crack appeared. The Brazilian submarine, following theoretical protocols, moved into a position that created an acoustic shadow, a blind spot that the mathematical models hadn't accounted for. Lex watched with growing alarm as the digital enemy forces began to exploit this gap. "Professor," she said quietly, raising her hand. "Not now, Captain." Dr. Northcott dismissed her without looking. "We're at a critical juncture of the theoretical demonstration." If only he had listened. What happened next would haunt the War College for years. The simulation continued, following its predetermined theoretical path. But Lex's operational experience was screaming warnings that her academic colleagues couldn't hear. In the Mediterranean, in the Arctic, in real water with real lives at stake, she'd learned that textbook perfection often led to underwater graves. Commander Lisa Crenshaw, the Canadian Navy officer, caught Lex's eye. At 38, she had limited submarine experience but enough field time to recognize the tension in another operator's face. "Captain Morgan," she whispered, "something wrong." Her question would prove more significant than anyone imagined. 58 minutes into the simulation, disaster struck. The enemy forces, following realistic tactical doctrine, exploited the acoustic shadow that theory had created. In seconds, the digital display showed 3 Allied submarines destroyed and 2 more severely damaged. Only 1 submarine remained operational. The classroom fell silent. Dr. Northcott stared at the screen in disbelief. Commander Ashford's face had gone pale. This wasn't supposed to happen. 15 years of theoretical refinement had just resulted in catastrophic failure, but the worst was yet to come. "Run it again," Dr. Northcott commanded, his voice shaking slightly. "There must be a programming error." The simulation reset. Once more, the 6 submarines followed theoretical protocols. Once more, the enemy exploited the acoustic shadow. Once more, 5 of 6 Allied submarines died. Lieutenant Commander Westbrook stared at the screen in horror. Major Eduardo Silva, the Brazilian officer, had gone rigid as he watched his submarine repeatedly fall victim to the theoretical flaw. The entire foundation of their tactical education was crumbling before their eyes. That's when Captain Morgan stood up, and everything changed forever. "Permission to speak, Professor." Lex's voice cut through the shocked silence. "This is not the time for operational commentary," Dr. Northcott snapped, his academic authority challenged by the failure of his life's work. "With respect, sir," Lex continued, her green eyes locked on the tactical display, "your mathematical models don't account for thermal layer variations in the North Atlantic. In real water, that spacing creates an acoustic shadow that any experienced sonar operator would exploit." The words hit the classroom like depth charges, but the explosion was just beginning. Commander Ashford stepped forward aggressively. "Captain Morgan, theoretical calculations are based on comprehensive data analysis. Field experience is anecdotal and unreliable." "Field experience," Lex replied with steel in her voice, "is why I'm still alive and why those submarines just died." Lieutenant Colonel Randolph's European training bristled at the direct challenge. Perhaps American submarine commanders are too aggressive to appreciate the subtleties of mathematical precision. But what happened next would silence every critic in the room. Lex moved to the tactical display, her fingers dancing across the control interface with practiced precision. "May I demonstrate an alternative approach?" "This is highly irregular," Dr. Northcott protested, but Admiral Dorothy Hartwell's voice cut through the tension from the back of the room. "Let her proceed, Professor." The Admiral had been observing silently, but the simulation failures had triggered her command instincts. At 58, she'd risen through ranks that preferred men, and she recognized something in Captain Morgan that the academics were missing. The next 12 minutes would rewrite naval tactical doctrine. Lex reset the simulation but modified the submarine spacing based on her Arctic Mediterranean experience. Instead of rigid mathematical intervals, she positioned the submarines using thermal layer awareness and acoustic terrain following, techniques she'd pioneered in the Eastern Mediterranean. In real water, she explained as she worked, thermal layers create natural concealment corridors. Mathematical models can account for water temperature variations that change hourly. The students watched in fascination as she reconfigured the entire formation. Her operational experience translated complex underwater reality into tactical advantage that pure theory had missed, but the real test was about to begin. "Run the simulation," Lex commanded. The display activated. 6 submarines moved through the North Atlantic, but this time following patterns based on operational reality rather than theoretical perfection. When the enemy forces attacked, they found no acoustic shadows to exploit. The Allied submarines slipped through their sensors like ghosts. Not one submarine was lost. The silence in the classroom was deafening. Dr. Northcott stared at the successful simulation, his 15 years of theoretical work suddenly revealed as incomplete. Commander Ashford's face had shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe. The international students were seeing their tactical education transform before their eyes. "How?" Lieutenant Commander Westbrook whispered. "Thermal awareness," Lex replied. "Something you can't learn from mathematical models. In the Mediterranean, water temperature variations create acoustic corridors that change with tidal patterns. Arctic operations taught me that submarine spacing must be dynamic, not static. But the real shock was still coming." Major Silva stood up slowly. "Captain Morgan, the Brazilian Navy has lost 2 submarines in the past 5 years following theoretical protocols. Could this acoustic shadow effect have been responsible?" The weight of his question settled over the room like a shroud. These weren't just academic exercises. They were tactical doctrines that real submarines followed in dangerous waters. How many lives had been lost to theoretical perfection that ignored operational reality? Professor Northcott, Admiral Hartwell's voice carried command authority that brooked no argument. "I think we need to discuss curriculum modifications." The old guard's resistance was about to crumble completely. "This is one simulation," Dr. Northcott protested weakly. 15 years of peer-reviewed research can't be invalidated by field improvisation. "It's not improvisation," Commander Crenshaw said quietly. "It's evolution. Captain Morgan isn't destroying your theory, she's completing it." Her words hit like a revelation. The classroom dynamics shifted as the international officers began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't academic versus operational. It was incomplete knowledge becoming complete. But Captain Morgan's biggest challenge was still ahead. Lieutenant Colonel Randolph, her European pride still stinging from the earlier exchange, stood rigidly. Even accepting these modifications, international submarine cooperation requires diplomatic protocols that American directness typically overlooks. Colonel, Lex replied with calm authority. "In the Aegean crisis last month, I coordinated American, Turkish, and British submarines using these same thermal layer techniques. Diplomatic protocol matters, but dead diplomats don't negotiate anything." The reference to her recent geopolitical success sent a ripple through the room. These academics lived in theoretical worlds, but Captain Morgan operated where theory met reality, and lives hung in the balance. The final confrontation was about to explode. "Enough!" Dr. Northcott's academic pride finally snapped. "This institution has trained naval officers for over a century. We don't need field operatives disrupting established curricula with untested theories." The classroom went silent. Every eye turned to Captain Morgan, waiting for her response to the direct challenge to her authority and expertise. Lex stood perfectly still for a moment, her green eyes holding the professor's gaze. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who commanded nuclear submarines in hostile waters. "Professor, with respect, your established curriculum just killed 5 submarines twice. My untested theory saved them all. I'll let the Admiral decide which approach the Navy needs." The words hung in the air like a judgment, and everyone knew the battle was over. Admiral Hartwell stepped forward, her command presence filling the room. "Professor Northcott, effective immediately. All tactical curricula will incorporate operational experience alongside theoretical analysis. Captain Morgan, I'm creating a new position, Director of Operational Academic Integration. Congratulations on your appointment." The announcement hit the classroom like a tsunami. Dr. Northcott's face went white. Commander Ashford stared in shock. The international students exchanged amazed glances as they witnessed the transformation of their educational institution. But the real victory was what happened next. Lieutenant Commander Westbrook stood up slowly. "Captain Morgan, the Royal Navy has been following similar theoretical protocols. Could you review our submarine tactics courses?" Major Silva nodded eagerly. "The Brazilian Navy requests the same evaluation." One by one, the international officers began requesting operational input for their national curricula. The academic resistance was crumbling as reality displaced theory. Commander Crenshaw smiled openly. "Captain, the Canadian Navy would be honored to host your first international tactical seminar." The revolution was spreading beyond the classroom. Lieutenant Colonel Randolph remained rigid for a moment longer, her European training warring with the evidence before her eyes. Finally, she spoke with grudging respect. "Captain Morgan, NATO requests your participation in our next submarine warfare symposium. Perhaps American directness combined with operational expertise is exactly what international cooperation requires." The admission was stunning. The officer who'd criticized American women's approach to international relations was now requesting their leadership. But Captain Morgan's response surprised everyone most of all. "Colonel Randolph, with respect, this isn't about American versus European approaches. It's about operational reality versus academic theory. Every Navy represented here has officers who've learned these lessons in dangerous waters. We need to listen to them." Her gracious response transformed the final holdout. Instead of claiming victory over European bias, she'd redirected the conversation toward collaborative learning. The classroom dynamics shifted from confrontation to cooperation. The aftermath would reshape naval education forever. Dr. Northcott sat heavily in his chair, the weight of 15 years of incomplete theory settling on his shoulders. But instead of bitterness, something unexpected crossed his face: curiosity. "Captain Morgan," he said quietly, "would you be willing to co-author a paper on thermal layer tactical applications? My mathematical models combined with your operational data might create something neither of us could achieve alone." The offer was stunning. The man who dismissed her as lacking analytical capability was now requesting collaboration, and Lex Morgan's response revealed the leader she truly was. "Professor, I'd be honored, but I want Commander Ashford and Colonel Randolph as co-authors too. This integration requires all perspectives: academic rigor, tactical theory, international cooperation, and operational reality." Her inclusive approach stunned the room. Instead of claiming individual victory, she was building a collaborative foundation that respected everyone's expertise while correcting their blind spots. Admiral Hartwell nodded approvingly. "Captain Morgan, your first assignment as director is establishing joint academic operational review boards at all major naval institutions. The Navy needs this integration yesterday." 6 months later, the impact was undeniable. The first graduation class under the new integrated curriculum showed remarkable improvements in tactical assessments. Submarine officers trained in thermal layer awareness reported significantly better operational outcomes. International cooperation exercises achieved success rates that pure theoretical training had never matched. But the real measure of success came from the fleet itself. Submarine commanders who'd struggled with textbook tactics found new confidence in operationally tested approaches. Accident rates dropped, mission success rates climbed, lives were saved. The revolution that started in one classroom had transformed naval warfare itself. Captain Alexandra Lex Morgan stood in her new office overlooking Narragansett Bay, reading reports from submarine commands worldwide. Her integration of academic theory with operational reality had created something unprecedented. a tactical education system that prepared officers for real underwater combat, not just classroom success. The woman who'd been dismissed as lacking analytical capability had become the architect of naval tactical evolution. But the most important victory was the lesson learned by every officer who witnessed that day. Dr. Northcott, now co-director of the integrated program, often told new students, "Theory without operational reality is dangerous fantasy. Reality without theoretical foundation is chaos." Captain Morgan taught us that excellence requires both, and the wisdom to know when experience must guide education. The Naval War College had learned that challenging established authority isn't disrespect, it's evolution. And sometimes the most important lessons come from those brave enough to stand up and say, "Your theory just killed people. Let me show you a better way." That Tuesday morning, nobody knew that one woman's challenge to academic authority would save thousands of lives across the world's oceans. But Captain Morgan did what she'd always done. She chose operational reality over comfortable theory, collaboration over confrontation, and effectiveness over ego. The Naval War College was never the same, neither was submarine warfare, and that was exactly how it should be.